Excellent. Um, Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you joining us today for one of the highlights of our year, our Cray Annual Lecture. It's a particular delight to welcome Professor Laura Crane today, Director of the Autism Center for Education and Research, also known as ACER, at the University of Birmingham. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Mel Romualdez, and I am the Director of Cray. As you may already know, here at the Center for Research in Autism and Education, we are a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within UCL's Institute of Education and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Our mission is to conduct high-quality, cutting-edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from it. At Cray, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research, right from ideas and design all the way to the sharing of outcomes. This is what makes the work we do meaningful for the wider autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all our funders, supporters, and the wonderful Cray team who make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that makes all of the work we do possible. As always, we invite you to become part of the conversation, either in the chat or with more anonymity in the Q&A. A recording of this lecture will be uploaded to our Cray YouTube channel in the next few days. And after the lecture, there will be a Q&A portion. So please stick around for that. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, somebody who has been such an important part of Cray's story, Professor Laura Crane. Laura joined Cray in 2015 and served as our Deputy Director from 2017 until the end of 2023. She is the current Director of ACER at the University of Birmingham. Her research focuses on topics that are truly reflective of the research priorities of autistic people, including education, mental health and well-being, the diagnostic and post-diagnostic journey, and access to justice. It is these shared priorities that bring us together this evening. Laura served as Specialist Advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on the Autism Act 2009, where she helped shape the landmark report, Time to Deliver. This work is the subject of tonight's talk. Laura, so good to have you back with us. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mel, and thank you to the Cray team more broadly as well for a really incredible honour in terms of getting to deliver today's annual lecture. As Mel mentioned, I was based at Cray for several years. I even hosted the Cray annual lecture on occasion. So it's really, really amazing and only a little bit terrifying to have this opportunity to speak with you all today. But it is really, really exciting though, because in a sense, it tops off what has been one of the most amazing years in my professional career, getting to serve as the Specialist Advisor to the House of Lords Committee on the Autism Act. And as Mel said, that is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So Mel's touched upon this a little bit already, but I thought it might be helpful just to start by introducing myself a bit more fully for anyone who might be unfamiliar with my work, but also because I think it gives a really helpful context for why I was keen to take on the role of Specialist Advisor to this committee. So in terms of my research, it spans a really broad range of areas, and I've mapped out a few of these here. So things like healthcare and education and criminal justice. But what's particularly helpful in this situation, and is possibly why I was a good fit for the Specialist Advisor role, is that these are all the areas covered in the government's current autism strategy. And while my work covers quite a few disparate areas, I think there's also a few kind of clear threads. So the first is that all of my work focuses on community priorities. So areas and topics that matter to autistic people and to those who support them. And I think I achieved this through the second thread, which is by conducting research with a really broad range of people, whether that's autistic people and their family members or professionals working across these different fields. I really try to understand what work would matter to them and what they think will help make a really tangible difference to their lives or to their practice. And I think it's that latter point that's particularly key for me. So not just doing research for the sake of doing research, but really trying to use that knowledge to champion for change. And I think, again, this is what was really appealing about the opportunity to support the work of the committee. So hopefully making a really tangible change to policy and practice, and ideally on a fairly big scale. But would anything actually change as a result of the committee's work? Well, this was actually a question that was put to me by the brilliant Yolanta Lasota, who is the CEO of the charity Ambitious About Autism. We were actually together at the start of the committee's work, so kind of hanging out in the House of Lords, as you do. And we were talking about kind of how exciting it was to be there. And she asked me kind of what I made of all of this and whether I thought it would have any difference. And my answer was, to be honest, I didn't know. I really hoped it might, but I didn't know. But that interaction and that question really stayed with me throughout my time supporting the committee. And it's a question that I'm going to come back to later on in the talk as well. So reflecting a little bit about what has changed, as well as what hasn't changed, and what more we need to do. So in terms of how I'm going to get to that point and what I'm going to cover, I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about the House of Lords, so what it does and how it works. And I'm going to be perfectly honest that until about 18 months ago, I didn't really know anything about the House of Lords. And while I certainly wouldn't purport to be an expert even now, I am certainly much more knowledgeable now than I was before. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it and how it works, and particularly about their model for special inquiry committees, which is what we had for the Autism Act. I'm going to talk about the committee's process and the final report, but instead of talking through everything in the report, I'm just going to touch upon a few points briefly, and then I'll reflect on what this means in terms of some broader contextual kind of challenges and complexities for the sector. Things like the current debates about potential overdiagnosis of autism, for example. And while I can't kind of say that I have the answers to these things, it's really just to draw attention to some of the key areas that people working in this space or, living this space should be aware of. And then finally, I'm going to finish with a few reflections on what's next. So going back to that question that Yolanta posed to me about whether anything has changed or will change, and I'll talk about what I think we can try and do to help make sure that it does. So I'll start off with what happened. And I'm going to start off with a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the House of Lords. So for those of you who may not be aware, in our Parliament we have two chambers. So we have the House of Lords and we have the House of Commons. And fun fact, they are marked up as green and red here, but that is not just on this slide. So some of you may be aware that if you go into the Commons, you see that things like the benches and the carpets and things are green. And then if you're in the Lords, everything is red. So it's quite easy to work out where you are. And then if something is blue, then you know you're in royal territory, like the King's robing room, where he will go and get dressed before the state opening of Parliament and things like this. While there are different colour schemes across the Commons and the Lords, the work of the two houses is quite complementary. And there's lots of similarities as well. So they're both involved in developing laws, in checking the work of the government, and in terms of debating current issues. But the Commons is publicly elected, with members of the Commons being our MPs, our members of Parliament. So it's the place where we see people like whoever our Prime Minister is, Chancellor, Secretaries of State, government ministers, and so on. And then in the Lords, the role of our Lords is really to check and challenge the work of government, and to support with shaping different laws by scrutinising potential legislation. Lots of former MPs go on to become members of the House of Lords, but the 800 odd members of the Lords come from a real range of backgrounds, and I'm going to tell you about some of them, so the ones on the Autism Act committee, a bit later on. But a key thing to note is that each year the House of Lords has a range of committees. Some of these run as standard. So these are permanent committees, like in the areas of public services and science and technology and economic affairs. But members of the Lords can also propose special inquiry committees, and these focus on a specific and topical issue. And in 2025, after members nominated topics for committees and a selection process took place, there were four special inquiry committees that ran. So one was on home-based working, one was on social mobility policy, one was on UK engagement with space, which I happen to be very jealous of because Tim Peake, the astronaut, came and gave evidence. But also, more importantly, one on the Autism Act of 2009. And in all fairness, this did also have some fairly awesome people come and give evidence as well. What I will mention at this point is that I think we should say a massive thank you and well done to both Baroness Browning and to Lord Tuig, who are both staunch advocates for autism and for the autistic community. And they nominated the Autism Act as a focus of a select committee inquiry. So without that nomination, it wouldn't have been an area of focus or attention in the way that it was. And I should also note here as well, actually, that this committee was what's called a post-legislative scrutiny committee. So one of these four select committees will always be a committee set up to look at a particular law and to evaluate how well that law is working. So the law that was the area of focus for 2025 was the Autism Act of 2009. And the Autism Act was really important because it was the first ever disability specific piece of legislation in England. We now have the Down Syndrome Act of 2022 as well, but the Autism Act really was a very landmark law in England. And the Act itself came about as a private member's bill that won support through the really incredible efforts of, among many other people, the late Right Honourable Cheryl Gillan MP, who again was a really staunch advocate for the autistic community. And back in 2009, she explained that the bill wasn't intended to do everything that was needed to help support autistic people, but it was designed to address some of the structural disadvantages faced, particularly for autistic adults who were at that time really devoid of any services that were felt to meet their needs. Now, the Act itself is actually very short, so it's just 4 pages long. But as the committee's report says, its importance far outweighs its size. And it's particularly important because in those 4 pages, it has a provision that requires the government to introduce and review an adult autism strategy for England. So just to clarify, a government strategy will be a document that outlines kind of top priorities in an area, as well as some key objectives and also some specific actions that have to be taken to meet those objectives. The Autism Act also requires there to be statutory guidance for the National Health Service and for local authorities. So statutory guidance is official government issued advice that organisations have to follow in order to comply with the law. And because it's legally binding, it has to be adhered to unless there's a really quite exceptional reason why it can't be. So the first autism strategy was published in 2010, along with the statutory guidance. And the original strategy and statutory guidance were updated just over 10 years ago, so kind of 2014, 2015. And then came what's on this slide, so the current autism strategy, which was published in 2021 and goes up to 2026, July 2026, in fact. And really importantly, this strategy for the first time moved beyond just adults to also include children and young people. And the current strategy covers 6 key areas. So improving understanding and acceptance of autism within society, improving autistic children and young people's access to education and supporting positive transitions to adulthood, supporting more autistic people into employment, tackling health and care inequalities for autistic people, building the right support in the community and supporting people in inpatient care, and improving support within the criminal and youth justice systems. So this strategy will remain in place until a new one is published. But what is worthy of mention is that the statutory guidance, so the associated legally binding advice about what needs to be delivered, actually hasn't been updated since 2015. So it's very, very outdated now. But that is the autism strategy. And as I mentioned, the Autism Act committee was set up as one of 4 special inquiry committees. And the remit of that committee was to focus on the implementation of the Autism Act, the operation of the statutory guidance, and the effectiveness of the autism strategy. The membership of the committee was agreed in January 2025 and met for the first time in February 2025. And this slide shows the membership of the committee, which includes the committee chair, Baroness Kate Rock. And the 12 members themselves represented different political parties, and we also had some crossbenchers, so people who were unaffiliated to the different political parties. And the committee members themselves came from a really diverse set of professional backgrounds with expertise across a real range of sectors such as business and healthcare and criminal justice and social care, for example. And the committee members themselves were incredibly impressive. It's hard to kind of pick people to narrow down to because, as I said, they're all really impressive in their fields. But just to name a couple, just as examples, Lord Crisp, for example, used to be the Chief Executive of the National Health Service, and Lord Hope, a very senior judge who served as Deputy President of the Supreme Court. So a huge amount of expertise across respective fields, even if that expertise may not be specific to autism. That said, though, we did have experts in autism, including members of the committee who were key in championing the original Autism Act, such as Baroness Browning and Baroness Pitt-Keithley. I think having that historical context represented was really invaluable. But also, I think, really worthy of mention is that several members of the committee also had personal connections to the topic. And I'll talk about that in more detail later on as well. But the thing that I just really want to emphasize, having worked with this group of people, is that this topic really mattered to so many of them for so many different reasons. And I can really attest to how seriously they took their roles on this committee and also how deeply personal it was for them. I think we were really lucky to benefit from this group and from all of their expertise. There's also a few other really important people that are worthy of recognition, and that is the brilliant Stuart Stoner, who was the clerk of the committee, Lucy Valsamides, who was the committee's policy analyst, and Abdullah Ahmad, who was the committee's operations officer. They all worked in Chris Clark's team and were supported by their colleagues Anila and Clayton. This is a team for whom I don't have a very good photo, so huge apologies for that, including the fact you can only see the back of Lucy's head. I'm hugely apologetic. But this is also a team for whom the work of the committee really, really mattered, and they did the most unbelievable job behind the scenes. They were so knowledgeable that you would have thought they'd been researching this topic for 20 odd years rather than me. And everything that they did was just so meticulously researched, so thoughtfully considered. And again, they cared really deeply and took their responsibility to the autistic community very, very seriously as well. So they deserve a huge well done and a huge thank you. And in terms of me, my role was a specialist advisor. So really importantly, I wasn't a member of the committee, but I advised the committee. In terms of how this came about, I received an email one day from the House of Lords, as you do, and it mentioned that they were doing an inquiry into the Autism Act, and they were scoping the potential work of the committee, including different issues and potential witnesses and so on. And they asked if I'd be open to a meeting to discuss it further. And because this kind of thing doesn't happen every day, I of course said yes. And this meeting was with Stuart, the clerk of the committee, and with Lucy, the policy analyst. And to be honest, I was so nervous, I can't even really remember anything that we spoke about. But I do recall that at the end, they said that they might be appointing a specialist advisor, and they told me a bit about the role and asked if I might be interested. So naturally, I said yes again. And then what followed was a bit of a blur. But I did have an interview with the chair of the committee, Baroness Rock, and this was an online interview. I was also asked to participate in an in-person seminar with members of the committee. So I came to Westminster, I gave a short presentation and took questions from members of the committee. And I was also asked to review some documents and give some feedback. And they were really great to do actually, because it gave me a really good understanding of the kind of things that I would be doing if I was appointed. And yeah, I was beyond thrilled when they asked me to take on the role. I think that happened on a Thursday, and then I was in Westminster on the Monday for my first session. So it was really, really quick. But as I said, it's been such a highlight. Not least because the House of Lords is a pretty kind of special place to be in, but because it was an opportunity, as I said, to enact some change. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly the committee did and also how I supported them. And I'm going to start off just by mentioning that a lot of the committee's work was underpinned by the need for meaningful involvement from a real diversity of people, and particularly those with lived experience. So, autistic people themselves, but also those who support them in different capacities. And I'm not going to read this slide word for word, but I've just put on here a kind of short excerpt from the committee's final report. And it's about the involvement of those with lived experience in the work of the committee. And I'll just highlight a couple of things that this emphasises. So, first of all, I think it reflects how the committee thought really carefully about the involvement of people with lived experience, particularly those who are autistic themselves. But it does also emphasise the kind of constraints that they had, given both the nature of parliamentary proceedings generally, but also of committee work more specifically. So in terms of who was on the committee, for example, members had to be current members of the House of Lords. So you can't have lay members on a committee like this, such as representatives from the community. And while members can put themselves forward for a committee because they have a personal interest in the topic, those wouldn't necessarily have to be shared. So everyone has to declare conflicts of interest, like if you're affiliated with an autism charity, for example, or have a business interest. But sharing personal information about yourself or your family is a personal decision. So even if there was lived experience represented, it wouldn't necessarily be public information. The other thing to mention really is about time. Special committee inquiries are very short, they're just 10 months. But we know that if we want meaningful involvement of people with lived experience, not just in policy, but research and in practice, it will take time. So what this means is that it wasn't the case that the committee's work could be co-produced or co-developed. It had to be, the report had to be authored and owned by the committee. But there was a lot that they could do and did do to try and ensure the meaningful involvement of autistic people and others with lived experience throughout their work. And one of the things that the committee started by doing was engaging with some of the major charities in the field. And personally, I think we've got a huge amount to thank these charities for in terms of steering the work of the committee. So they really pushed for the meaningful involvement of autistic people and those who supported them. They taught the committee about autism and autistic culture, recognising that not all of the members were experts in this area, at least not at first. They advised on inclusion and accessibility. They canvassed lots of views together to feed into the committee's work, and they really championed the cause. And I certainly think they're going to have a really important role to play moving forward as well. As well as engaging with the key autism charities, the committee took oral evidence from a really broad range of people. So every Monday there were oral evidence sessions in the Lords, and they, in terms of kind of topic, it kind of followed the structure of the Act and the implementation of the Act and the strategy, and then it went into kind of deep dives into different areas of the strategy. So things like awareness and understanding of autism, and then assessment, diagnosis, education, and so forth. And the way that the oral evidence sessions worked was that there were a few key leaders in the space who were invited along. They're referred to as witnesses. And we tried to make sure that there was a diversity of people here, including those who were autistic and those who supported autistic people. And representation was a major consideration. But the way that the sessions ran was every Monday there was the focused topic, the panel of witnesses, and the committee would pose questions to those witnesses. That would last for about 2.5 hours, either as one full session or two shorter sessions. In advance, I'd be asked to review the committee's briefing pack and their list of suggested questions and give feedback on those. And in advance, the committee would also decide who wanted to ask and explore which of the areas. And then we'd have the sessions, and part of it, the kind of main part of it, was streamed live, and they're all recorded and they're freely available to watch online. There were just a few of the sessions which were marked as private, so some sessions with government officials and also some with different members of the autistic community. Once we had the sessions and the witnesses left and the cameras went off, there was a kind of closed committee discussion to reflect on some of the issues. And it was at that point that our chair, Baroness Rock, would come to me for comment. And my role essentially was to perhaps reinforce key points, so maybe reflect on where the evidence might be particularly strong or where it was more lacking or where there may have been an omission. So for each session, I just picked kind of 3 key points that I thought were worthy of reiterating to the committee or that they might like to reflect on further. The other thing I would do here as well is if the committee members had questions, they might be unfamiliar with something a witness was talking about or wanted more information, they might ask me to elaborate. But really importantly, I didn't direct proceedings, I didn't have decision-making power. My role was really there to guide and advise where needed in a kind of very balanced and thoughtful and evidence-informed way. As well as the oral evidence, the committee took written evidence from a much broader range of people, and there was a lot of written evidence submitted. We actually believe it was a record in terms of the amount of written evidence ever received by a House of Lords Select Committee, which I think is just amazing. And I think it really shows the strength of feeling and the commitment, to this topic. And this is one of the routes where a large amount of evidence was received from the autistic community and also others with lived experience. And I would say as well, for both the oral evidence and the written evidence, it's hard to quantify how much of that was kind of lived experience, because not everyone would declare that. But there were certainly a real diversity of views represented and a diversity of people represented too. And I think sometimes people can be a bit skeptical about whether written evidence actually makes any difference to committees. But I can confirm, because I saw it firsthand, every single piece of written evidence was very, very carefully read by the team, and was also reflected on very, very thoughtfully. So, it is worth taking the time to submit evidence when opportunities like this arise. And really importantly, you don't have to be an academic, you don't have to be representing an organisation. Individual testimonies were really powerful too. And certainly they resonated very, very strongly with different members of the committee. In addition to the oral and written evidence, the committee also went on a couple of visits, which I accompanied them on, and these were great. One visit was to Phoenix School in Tower Hamlets in East London. And for those who aren't familiar with Phoenix, this is a huge special school that provides education to autistic young people across a range of ages who have complex support needs. So we had the opportunity to go and see some of the classes in action. We met with a panel of parents from the school, and we also spoke with staff. And what was particularly special here as well is that Phoenix doesn't just support their own pupils, but they also run an outreach service where they provide support to a much broader range of autistic young people via specialist classrooms in local mainstream schools. So we got to learn all about that too. And then the other visit that we did was to St Thomas's Hospital, so just round the corner from Westminster. We literally walked there after one of the evidence sessions. And that was a great opportunity to get to speak to some interns and staff who were part of a supported employment programme. And it was really great to hear, particularly firsthand from the interns, about what was working well and where support could be strengthened. So all of this fed in to recommendations. And then the other involvement that the committee had was from Parliament's autistic champions, who came and gave evidence to the committee in a private session. And the role of the autistic champions is to review and provide feedback on Parliament's public engagement services from the perspective of those with lived experience. So they feedback on things like if you come and visit Parliament, what the experience is like, if you go on a tour, how you access information on the website, and so on. So this meeting was an opportunity to get to learn about the work they were doing, but also to discuss a really broad range of issues that impacted that community. And we heard around, lots of issues mentioned about different areas of the strategy there. So that process of gathering and reviewing evidence and listening to and learning from people took months and lots of hard work by the committee members and the committee team. And the team spent most of last summer drafting the final report, which is here. And actually, even before this, so when the kind of draft report was together, so I think that was about September 2025, the committee would meet on several occasions to go through the report, literally at times page by page, to try to make sure that all the key issues were appropriately covered and that they got the recommendations and conclusions right. And they spent a lot of time focusing on those. And the report itself was published in November 2025. What was slightly scary about this was that at the very start of my involvement, so I think it was during my interview with the committee chair, one of the things that I was asked was how I'd feel about supporting the work of the committee, but not having ownership of the final report. And they asked that because the report is that of the committee and it's authored by the committee. So while I could and did advise on what was in and what was out and on the recommendations and so on, the committee didn't have to accept my recommendations. And I will be honest that that was a little bit anxiety provoking. I did feel a really big sense of responsibility in taking on this role, given the profile of it, and also the implications of it in terms of potentially guiding the next autism strategy. And I will be honest, I did spend some time kind of rehearsing in my mind what I would say to critics who maybe read the final report and didn't like it, a kind of, don't blame me kind of thing. But actually, what I can say is that I do really like the final report and I really strongly endorse all of its recommendations. And I will add that I think my anxiety about this issue kind of went down week by week as I worked more closely with the committee members and the committee team and the committee chair. And I got to see just how much this mattered to them, how carefully they were considering the evidence, and also how balanced and thoughtful they were with their approach. And I do think that's really reflected in the final report. Now, the report itself is not a short report. So it's 252 pages, I think. And I'm not going to go through the whole report and I'm not going to go through all the recommendations, but I thought I'd just quickly, for anyone who hasn't seen the report, kind of note a few key points. So one of the first key things to mention is that the Autism Act changed awareness, but it wasn't thought to change outcomes. So the committee found that while the Autism Act helped make autistic people more visible and improve recognition of autism to a degree, it didn't succeed in removing the barriers that autistic people face in everyday life. And they added that they still feel that there are persistent inequalities faced by autistic people across a range of areas, such as health and education and employment and criminal justice. Second, the committee felt that successive governments have failed to deliver on the autism strategy. So while the committee concluded that the current strategy had the right ambitions and that they reflected autistic people's priorities, after its first year, there was no funded delivery plan, no clear accountability, and really poor implementation. And they felt that that just wasn't good enough. And then finally, the committee emphasised that there really needs to be a new autism strategy and one that focuses on support rather than crisis management. So lots of the evidence considered by the committee showed that lots of autistic people struggle to access timely support. They face really long waiting lists for assessment and often only reach help at crisis point. So the committee called for a new strategy with really clear outcomes, really clear accountability, and crucially, I think, lifelong support at every stage of life. So what does this look like in practice? Well, I think it's really tough because the landscape around autism is in quite a challenging place at the moment. And that's what I'm going to turn to next. And what I've outlined on this slide is a few of the challenges and complexities and questions that I think we're going to really need to address if we're going to make any progress in meeting the needs of autistic people from both a kind of policy and practice perspective. And I think some of these are really long-standing issues, but others are changing and are a bit more live and dynamic at the moment as well. But the first thing I want to turn to is something that I think is very live at the moment. And that is the question around what autism actually is and where the boundaries of autism lie. So this question came up very early in the work of the committee, particularly in relation to rising rates of identification and assessment and diagnosis of autistic people. So essentially the question of why are more and more people being identified, assessed and diagnosed as autistic? And for anyone familiar with the field, there's clear explanations here. Awareness has increased, professionals have become better at recognising autism, diagnostic criteria and our understanding of autism has changed and broadened over time. But more recently, the narrative has been shifting and there's growing, I think, public and political debate about the breadth of the autism label. And certainly very early in the committee's work. So I think we were just like a couple of sessions in. The then Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, suggested in a televised interview that this might be the case, that the label of autism is very broad, and he used the term overdiagnosis. And although that position was subsequently softened, I think largely in part due to a bit of a backlash from some quarters, It led to the commissioning of a review into the prevalence of autism, ADHD, and mental health conditions. And we've got the interim report of that, but the final report hasn't been released yet. And I think obviously the key concern for people here is whether access to diagnosis could end up being restricted in some way. So could future criteria be narrowed rather than broadened out? And I think this raises some much broader questions too. Should support be based on diagnosis or need? Should autism be subgrouped or not? Should autism even remain a primary organising category for services and systems? Should there be autism specialist pathways? And I think, I would need a whole other lecture to, I think, even delve into one of those in the debate, in the depth that they deserve. And I'm sure there's other people better kind of placed to speak to those than I would. But what I will emphasise is that these aren't just kind of abstract debates. And I know that many of the autism charities and many service providers are quite worried around the kind of shifting narratives and about the way that autism is being discussed in both kind of politics as well as kind of mainstream media. And as I said, I won't really go into this in much depth, but I'll just stress some of the recommendations from the committee, which I think are really important here. So the committee was really, really clear that we are not currently, and nor are we anywhere near being in a position where the protections for autistic people linked to the Autism Act and the autism strategy can or should be stripped away. And I know that the autism charities are working very, very hard and also very collectively at the moment to address what they perceive to be a real risk for the autistic community here. And I think part of this relates to how services and supports are designed and set up to meet people's needs. Because ultimately this kind of comes down to an economic issue. We've got lots of demand, but not enough service provision. And one of the things that the committee heard a lot about was about how the system is organised around responding to crisis rather than preventing it. And this is a really central report in a great report from the Autism Alliance that came out recently, which really makes it clear that some of the harms experienced by autistic people are not inevitable, but come from a failure to provide timely and appropriate support when it's needed. So essentially what they're referring to is the fact that at present, you'll often engage with services during diagnostic assessment and during crisis. But in between, support can be quite patchy and quite limited. And then the result of that is that needs escalate, sometimes quite significantly, before any support gets offered. And we heard some really powerful testimony, particularly from some autistic young people who experience these issues, sometimes with really quite harrowing consequences. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done here about how we move towards this more proactive system that identifies needs early, that provides kind of ongoing low-level support, but crucially also adapts as needs change. And we know that autistic needs are very dynamic. And I think there's also some really great work that we heard about as part of the committee's work in Manchester, for example, where they have step care models. So definitely some good practice taking place, but nothing really kind of consistent or widespread here either. And that links to another point that I wanted to mention, which is that there is a consistent call across different sectors for things like better training, greater awareness, more autism-informed practice. But a lot of this happens in isolation. So it happens within individual systems and sectors rather than across them. And I think that really matters because a lot of the challenges that we're trying to address here aren't confined to single sectors. And of course, autistic people will move, between and across these systems and sectors throughout the life course. So they've really got to join up. And there's some really brilliant examples of good practice that we heard about during the committee's work. So within education, for example, we went to visit Phoenix School, where they have specialist classrooms and inclusion hubs. And when we went to do that visit, I recall Lord Crisp, who used to run the National Health Service, drawing a comparison between those kind of specialist classroom models and the teaching hospital model in the NHS. So spaces that don't just deliver support to people, but also build expertise, train staff, and model good practice as well. And we've got this happening elsewhere too. So in education at the moment, there is a lot about making spaces more kind of sensory friendly, having sensory kind of rooms, having inclusion hubs. And equally in prisons, we've got things like adapted sensory environments and we've got neurodiversity wings that are cropping up. Um, but things like this are rarely connected. So we've got the same idea kind of being developed and tested and refined lots of times in lots of sectors, often without any kind of shared learning or dissemination. And I think that actually happens a lot within sectors, let alone kind of across them as well. So I think a big question here is how we create mechanisms not just to kind of deliver services, but to share the learning as well in a much more intentional way. But I think this also leads to a kind of fundamental question here, which is whether any of this is even about autism at all. Because one of the central conclusions from the committee's report was not that there's a lack of autism-focused policy or guidance, but just a failure to implement it. So we saw the same thing come up repeatedly in terms of really unclear responsibility, lack of accountability, and insufficient follow through on commitments that have been made. And it reminds me of a very early session we had with the committee where James Cusack, who was the then chief exec of the charity Autistic, came. And he made the point in one of the sessions that if he, as the chief executive of his charity, went to his trustees with some blue sky thinking about autism research and no clear action plan to achieve any of these goals, he'd probably just lose his job on the spot. But at the moment, he argued, that's exactly what we've got with the autism strategy. We've got some blue sky thinking, but no clear plan, no clear implementation plan. So where does that leave us? Well, the committee's report was published in November, and here's a picture of me holding the hard copy, which was very exciting to receive in the post. But after the report was published, the nature of special inquiry committees is that the committee officially ceases to exist at that point. So what happens next? Well, I'm going to go back to that question that Yolanta posed to me at the very, very start of proceedings about would anything actually happen? Well, there's two main ways that there is accountability following the end of the committee's work. So the first thing is that the government needs to respond within 2 months of the publication of the report. And they did. So the committee received a written response in the stated time from the Department of Health and Social Care, which is the government department under which the autism strategy sits. And that response is publicly available for anyone who is interested to go and read it. Then after that, there is a debate in the Lords, which only happened a little while ago, so on the 10th of June. And this is where the chair of the committee, so in our case, Baroness Rock, would deliver a speech about the work of the committee. And then the other members of the Lords, and this could be people who were on the committee, but also those who were not on the committee, can make comments and give speeches as well. And then after that, we get a response from the government minister, and we had the Under Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Social Care there. So that's Baroness Merrin. And what was also very exciting was that I was there. This was my first time watching the chamber in session. So I'm up there at the top with Lucy Balsamides, the committee's policy analyst. And it was exceptionally exciting to be there. What wasn't so exciting, however, was the response from the government. So in terms of the written response from the government, I have my own views on that, but I thought I'd draw on some of the views of the committee members instead. And we heard several of these during the debate in the chamber. So I'm just going to quote a couple for you here. So Baroness Browning commented that the charity sector described the report as unacceptable and added that that's putting it mildly. And Lord Crisp summed it up as bland, adding that it didn't say anything of substance. So if you haven't read it, I hope that would give you a flavour of what to expect. But essentially, the crux of it was that there was no clear steer on when we'd be seeing a new strategy. And this was despite a minister from the Department of Health and Social Care in one of the oral evidence sessions committing to a new strategy when the current one expired. The thing that was just kind of written in the response was really just lots of stuff about what the government's up to generally, but kind of impacts autistic people, but not immediately and not necessarily directly. So the debate in the chamber was the chance to really challenge the response. And as I said earlier, it involved lots of speeches. And some of them were so passionate and so powerful and deeply personal as well. So I would really encourage you, if you're interested, to watch it. Mainly the kind of speeches from the members of the Lords who were on the committee, and they spoke about different issues that came up and that impacted them and shaped their thinking from the time working on the committee. But when the government minister spoke, it started really well. So she emphasised the importance of supporting autistic people and started by saying that, we want to make sure we get this right. And with the committee's report, we absolutely will. But she added that she'd have to disappoint because a new strategy wasn't ready. And she also couldn't give a timeline of when a new strategy would be in place. Instead, a bit like the written response, it was a lot about kind of other general government initiatives at the moment, emphasising that the autism strategy doesn't sit in isolation. And, that is true to a degree. But as Baroness Rock rightly noted in her rebuttal, it just isn't acceptable that we still don't have a timeline. And she added that essentially the committee's done all the heavy lifting and there's no reason for this to be held up further. And another thing that she spoke about, which I agree is really crucial, is that nowhere in the minister's response was there anything about implementation, accountability, or responsibility. And Baroness Rock went on to say, and rightly so, we need a sense of urgency. But where to from here? So I guess this is where a kind of call for action comes in, but equally I want to be kind of realistic about this because, this isn't a new thing. People have been pushing for change in this space for a very long time, certainly since the Autism Act came into force, if not well before. And all we've seen is progress being quite slow and quite uneven and also quite hard won. But the reality is, much of the groundwork has been done. The evidence is there, the recommendations are there. And what's really needed now is some consistent, sustained implementation. But I do think that this is still a point where action really matters and where people can make a difference. So whether that's engaging with the kind of campaigns led by the autism charities, whether it's contributing to research that really makes a difference, whether it's contacting local MPs, I think all of these things are still really important. And I think this moment's really important as well, because we're in a really interesting place, I think. I think we're at a place where progress could stall or even move slightly backwards, given kind of things like concerns about pressures on diagnosis and on support. And obviously that has impacts on autistic people's rights. So it's really important, I think, that we keep pushing for change here. But what I do think is important to mention is that just because we haven't got the strategy yet, and even though we don't have a workable action plan or any kind of sense of accountability or responsibility, it doesn't mean that nothing came out of this. And I think there were some genuinely really positive and really important outcomes from the work of the committee. I think, first of all, I think it's another really powerful example of how the community comes out in force when it matters. This was the House of Lords Committee with the biggest ever turnout for written evidence. It was a space where the charities came together with really clear, consistent messaging and strong messaging too. And I think it was also a space where autistic voices and the voices of allies were really listened to and taken seriously. And the committee themselves commented on how rare they thought that was in these kind of spaces. Second, I think the committee gained some really strong allies. So several members spoke over time about their different personal connections to the topic. And it was a real privilege to get to hear their stories and understand why this mattered to the different members of the committee. And for some of them, their connections were already quite well known. But we also saw, particularly in that final debate in the Lord's Chamber, people speaking much more openly. So, for example, we had Baroness Rock talking about the impact of this and the importance of this for her autistic son. And we had Lord Eliot giving a really powerful speech, sharing for the very first time that he himself received his own autism diagnosis a few years ago. And he spoke about the impact that that had on him. And I think that, having members of the House of Lords stand up and speak publicly about identity in that space is not insignificant. And I really hope that carries on beyond the life of the committee as well and beyond the Lords too. And finally, I think the work of the committee really did raise the bar in terms of inclusion and accessibility in policy. So, as part of the work of the committee, people were properly prepared for sessions. They had choice and flexibility in how they took part. There were quiet spaces, sensory supports, and we engaged with a really diverse group of people, including those with very complex support needs, those from different minoritized backgrounds, and those with a real diversity of experience. And this kind of thing isn't that standard in this context, but it did get noticed. And actually, the committee was kind of too shy to kind of shout about this. But the team received an internal award for their work in terms of the inclusion and accessibility things that they were doing. They didn't shout about it because they still felt that they weren't doing enough. But I think that says something about their standards and also the potential there is for change here, which is incredible. So, we're at this position, we don't have the strategy that we need, and we don't have the scale of policy change that I think we want and would hope to see. But we didn't get nothing. And I think that still really matters because, we've got, shifts in things like voice and visibility and practice that hopefully, if we keep going, can make bigger changes possible. And another big positive of this is that I have got the opportunity today to tell you all about my little adventure. And it really was an adventure for which I am enormously grateful. And I'm going to just end now on a note of gratitude, just by saying thank you to a few people and groups. So first, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Autism Act Committee and especially to our chair, Baroness Kate Rock. Serving this committee truly has been one of the highlights of my career, and I am enormously grateful to have been trusted with this role and to have had the opportunity to work with everyone. So huge thank you. I'd really like to say thank you to the committee team who were so much fun to work with. I absolutely loved every minute and I really hope our paths cross again in future. To the Cray team, I miss you all enormously and I am beyond grateful that you have invited me back in this very esteemed capacity. And finally, to everyone who's taken the time to join tonight or who may be watching the recording afterwards, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate it. And I will finish there.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that. I love when you said that this is a really important moment. I couldn't agree more. It's always a pleasure to listen to you talk about your work, but I think this work in particular is extremely timely and relevant. So thank you for that. We have quite a few questions. I'm going to try and get to as many as possible. We'll see how we go with this. There are a couple that are very similar, so I'm going to combine them, and it's more generally about how effective you think a new autism strategy might be. Um, so I'm going to read this one from Joe. Joe says, great talk and work, Laura. Seeing the fact that the Autism Act did little to change outcomes for autistic people, would a new act deliver any different outcomes, and why would a new act be different?
Oh, what a good question. One of the things I should mention is that we started by considering whether it was important to have an Autism Act. And we particularly heard from the autism charities, but also, as I mentioned on the committee, there were people who were involved in setting up the Act. And I think the general consensus there was that it is very, very important to have that provision in law, and that any withdrawal of that or erosion of that was quite concerning. One of the things that the committee didn't do, this went beyond the scope of the committee, was to consider whether the Act itself could be changed in some way. So, for example, one of the things with the Act is that it does focus on adults, and actually the strategy has been broadened. So there can be ways in which the strategy differs from the original purpose of the Act. But one of the things that came up a couple of times was suggestions of whether the Act could be broadened beyond autism. So, for example, in Scotland, they were consulting on whether to have a learning disability, autism, and neurodivergence bill. Um, and there were also suggestions around whether it might be timely also to focus out a bit more into neurodivergence as opposed to autism. So they weren't things that the committee considered in depth, but I expect that they will be live conversations moving forward. Several members of the committee were very clear, though, that they felt that autism specificity was very important. I think we could have probably had a whole committee, session just on that. But there is also suggestion that the Act could, or strategy could be changed moving forward to incorporate both autism and ADHD, which would be an interesting combination. So I think moving forward, these are definitely going to be live conversations. I don't think the committee had done the work to really map out the kind of pros and cons of each of those different iterations. But certainly the strategy can go beyond. And I think the key thing as well, it's about that implementation. It's about that responsibility. It's about the accountability. There's some really good stuff in the strategy, but whether we're seeing the change, that's what was coming out very strongly.
Absolutely. You sort of answered another question that JB had about the Autism Act being condition specific, yet many people, including me, are ADHD and have overlapping neurodevelopmental conditions. And they asked, did the committee consider whether a broader neurodiversity act or strategy might better reflect people's lived experiences and reduce fragmentation between services? Um, I think you sort of answered that already.
Yeah, so as I said, it
Considered
wasn't, it
but
was
not.
something, yeah, it came up, it wasn't considered in depth. It was much more focused. And I should add, I think the reason it was focused on quite a lot was the fact that the committee felt that a key lever for change would be the fact that the autism strategy was coming to an end in July 2026. So the timing of this committee was very deliberate to really shape that strategy. But one of the things that did come up quite a lot, and I think particularly in certain sectors such as education, is that that broader lens is really helpful. I think it came up in employment a lot as well. So one of the things we heard a lot about was that good neuro-inclusive practice as standard is fundamental. And actually, if you have that good inclusive, neuro-inclusive practice as standard, more people's needs would be met, and there may be less demand for specialist services. So in some ways, I think a focus on neurodiversity or neurodivergence more broadly doesn't have to take away from the need for autism specificity where it's needed. And we certainly heard about some examples, for example, in healthcare, where actually that autism specific focus can be so pivotal. So in eating disorder services, for example, we see a lot of people coming into services and the standard treatment for eating disorders is not working. So when autism is identified as a co-occurring condition, the treatment plan can be adapted and much better meet that individual's needs. So there may be in healthcare some broader things that need to be done around neurodiversity and neuroinclusion, like making, the appointment process easier and the spaces more accessible. But actually, at times, that autism focus can be really, really important. So I think even if broadening out, having specificity where it's needed, and that being maybe on a sector by sector or, case by case basis may be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned education, and there is a question here from Tracy. In your personal opinion, which of the recommendations has the potential to make the biggest impact for autistic children in mainstream schools?
Ooh. It was interesting with education, actually. I can see another question that came up, a very good one, about whether the work of the neurodivergence task and finish group had input into the final report. So, for anyone who is unaware, the neurodivergence task and finish group was a task force set up by the Department for Education, specifically to look at how best to support neurodivergent children and young people in the education system. And we did have a session on education as part of the committee's work. And we had the chair of that group come and give evidence. But also, we had other members of that group also give evidence at different points of the committee's work. So, what was slightly frustrating was that the report from that group hadn't been published at that time. So, I think the report kind of alluded to the fact that this was coming and it drew on some of the things that were discussed in the session, but the report wasn't there. But I think one of the things, I think I should add as well, it is a really, really excellent report, and it certainly aligns with the committee's recommendations. But I think one of the key things there is about identification of need, and that is really, really key. In a lot of places in the UK at the moment, or in England, children and young people often will have access to support or diagnosis, but not necessarily both. And actually, both can be enormously important, but systems are really, really stretched. So there's a move towards focusing on how to identify that a young person has needs, recognizing that they may be across different diagnostic labels, and present differently in different educational environments. But I think there's a lot of work that's needed to develop the evidence base around that. But I think if we can identify young people's needs early, if we can appreciate that those needs are not static, but are dynamic and changing and can respond to that, I think hopefully that will be those steps that we need to take towards moving towards that more proactive system and not waiting till a young person's excluded from school or
Yeah,
isn't able to attend.
absolutely.
So I think moving forward, that will be really important. And that's not to say that diagnosis isn't important. I think it is, particularly for an individual and their identity. But I think identifying need early and responding to that is going to be really crucial.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that shift on the ground when talking to educators, and focusing more on need rather than specific categories of diagnosis. Moving on to an employment related question. Um, Someone said disability confident is often criticized as a PR exercise because employers can retain accreditation without demonstrating meaningful outcomes. Should accreditation be independently audited and linked to evidence, such as recruitment, retention, and progression rates for disabled and neurodivergent employees?
Gosh, great question. Mel, you're probably better placed to answer that than I am, actually, given your expertise in this area. But we did have Professor Kim Hott come and give evidence. We had a great session around employment that also featured Anna Remington from Cray. Um, but I agree. I think what's really disappointing is when people claim to be disability confident and are then not. And again, I think that responsibility and accountability piece that the committee's report emphasised is so key there. People need to know what they're responsible for. And if they do not achieve that, there needs to be some form of accountability and recompense. So I definitely think more needs to be done there. But I would definitely suggest rewatching or watching the session on employment, which covered that in more depth. And we also heard about Autistic's Neurodiversity Employers Index. And what was really nice about that in terms of hearing from the employers who were embedding it was that they genuinely saw the change happening. And, it was a journey for a lot of them. It wasn't all a quick fix, but they really engaged. And for so many people, neurodivergent and otherwise, it made such a huge difference to their ways of working and to their practice.
That's lovely to hear. There were a couple of questions related to intersectionality and how these matters were addressed by the committee. Um, an anonymous attendee said, this is great, but it concerns me that there's a lot of seemingly Caucasian, middle class, and above individuals involved with the voices of autistics and autistic allies within intersectional, marginalized communities like religion and social status included.
Great point. Um, Certainly, that was a major consideration for the committee. So when I joined as the specialist advisor, the committee had a structure of the kind of committee's work, and it had a list of some of the people that names that had come up through their conversations that they'd provisionally put in to the different sessions. But they themselves were very, very conscious about ensuring that there was representation and diversity, and particularly making sure that the voices of particular groups were included. So, just as a couple of examples, I remember we had Marsha Martin from Black Sen Mamas who came and gave evidence to the committee. And also, we went to Tower Hamlets, which is one of the most ethnically diverse boroughs in London, and met young people and families from a range of different backgrounds, where topics about things like culture and faith, came up in those conversations. So it was definitely something that the committee reflected on and was very, very conscious of. Um, and I think that will be key moving forward as well, making sure that the strategy and the recommendations don't just work for a subset of people, but really work for all. Um, Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really nice to hear that and to get this sort of behind the scenes information about that, and that it was a real consideration of the committee's work. Um, I've got another question, and I'll just read it out to you. Many autistic and neurodivergent people struggle with executive functioning, sensory issues, burnout, and fluctuating needs, but these difficulties are often poorly captured by the current personal independence payment descriptors. Did the committee discuss whether disability benefits assessments are fit for purpose for neurodivergent claimants?
Yes, so Baroness Browning, this is something that she was incredibly passionate about and raised on several occasions. Um, she mentioned in the final debate how she supports her autistic family members and certainly conveyed some really challenging experiences of having to try to navigate those systems, and was very, very keen that that was captured in the committee's discussions. I can't recall off the top of my head where or if or how that was featured in the report, but I can definitely say that Baroness Browning raised that on several occasions.
There's another question related to sort of involvement of other subgroups, and an anonymous attendee asked if about the extent to which non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic people were supported in terms of involvement. Was this something that was explored? And if so, was it by proxy, such as by a carer, or were there any avenues to engage directly with non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic people?
Yeah,
I think
great
it's a really
question. I think
important
this
question.
is one of the reasons that the committee team were quite reluctant to shout about the award that they received because they were very, very clear that they felt that they could have done more with more time. And I do think this is one of the areas that they were very conscious of. But there could have been more to get those kind of first person perspectives. So there was certainly witnesses that came to give evidence to represent by proxy those who were non-speaking. And we did hear from a lot of caregivers whose young people would not have been able to participate in the committee proceedings. And that was really, really important. But I do think, as with everything, there's always more that you can do. And I think that is probably one of the areas where greater attention could have been done. And I should add as well that, the committee did try very, very hard to, present information in different ways for different kind of forms of engagement. But I think there is more that could be done there. And what was great about charities and individuals and organisations was that they took it upon themselves to do some of this work to support the committee. So trying to elicit those voices who wouldn't have been able to engage with what was put together, and also sharing the results in more engaging ways. And actually, a few weeks ago, I was invited to Parliament and was part of a event where there was a panel on inclusion and accessibility across both the Commons and the Lords. And this was something that was being discussed in a lot of depth there. So it's a very live discussion. I said these things aren't very common in places like the House of Lords. So it's certainly kind of baby steps, and not the, co-production, co-development, those kind of things that you would like to see, but it definitely pushed the boundaries. And I was asked to come in and speak to the clerk of the select committees about meaningful involvement. I went in with my Einstein's ladder of citizen participation and, spoke about why this was really important. So it is something they're reflecting really deeply on, which was amazing, really.
I'm mindful of time, but do you have time for a couple more
Yeah.
questions? Is that all right? Amazing. Thank you so much. I do have a question here from Lucy,
Mhm.
who says, I noted the SEND reforms introduced a new category of executive function for children with SEN needs and EHCPs. Do you think we might see the Department of Health and Social Care replicating this category and approach in adult social care?
Interesting. My understanding is that this is a provisional category at the moment, so it may still be open to change in some way. But I do know that the Department of Education and Department of Health and Social Care are, looking at ways of working together. And I think there's real potential of a kind of shared language across those two. Um, Looking particularly at how we identify areas of need. So a colleague of mine, Susanna Castro-Kemp, does a lot of work around the International Classification of Functioning, which is one potential shared language across those different areas. So I think ideally, we've been, the field has been campaigning for better cross-sector working, particularly across education, health and social care. So I think a shared language and shared ways of working would be really beneficial there.
Absolutely, I agree. I think we've got time for one more question.
Mhm.
And I'm going to end on this note. Some really lovely comments from an anonymous attendee. They said, "Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I'm curious how you fitted in the commitment of being a specialist advisor for the committee, as well as all your other amazing academic career achievements and family life. You're an inspiration. I'm a mom of an autistic child and doing a PhD full time. This is a webinar I needed to hear today."
I think I might print that out and frame it and put it on my wall. That's very, very lovely. Thank you. Um, it was what I would say, it was a lot of work. One of the things that I really took the time to do was to understand the rhythm of the committee. And actually, that was really helpful because there was a very, very clear rhythm. So we were always in Westminster on a Monday, for example. Um, and I would get my briefing papers kind of the Thursday before. I'd be asked to give feedback and comment. I'd have the meeting with the chair of the committee kind of Monday lunchtime. We'd have the session, I'd type up, and the notes would be sent out a few days later. Um, so it was quite easy to kind of plan and organize my time, but I was very lucky to have the support of my School of Education at the University of Birmingham, who were just really pleased that I was able to take on this role and were able to kind of give me that time to engage with it. So I'm really, really grateful for that. In terms of balancing everything, I'm not sure I can say I did it particularly well. And I had to promise my children a kind of holiday in exchange for me not being around as much as I normally would be. But it really, really was such an incredible experience. It was very exciting for my children to kind of try and spot me on Parliament TV each week. And yeah, I'm just enormously grateful for this opportunity and really hope that it does, even if not immediately, lead to some positive changes.
Thank you so much, Laura, for taking the time to speak to us today and for answering all the questions. I'm so sorry to anyone whose question was not d featured today. There were a lot of you and so many questions and really excellent ones, but I hope that everyone enjoyed the annual lecture. And once again, thank you so much to Professor Laura Crane for speaking to us and sharing about her experience doing this work. Laura, thank you so much. And thank you to those of you who came to join us today.